Good evening, everyone. I'm Tracy Glab, Executive Director of the Flint Institute of Arts Museum and Art School. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Kamareddy Family Lecture. Tonight, we have Dr. Siddhartha Shah presenting Romancing the Stone, Gendering Jewels in Colonial India. The Kamareddy Family Lecture Series focuses on topics related to the art, history, and culture of South Asia, and is sponsored by JRC and Dr. Prasad Kamareddy. Let's give them a round of applause for their generous support. Following tonight's lecture is our first ever Splendors of South Asia celebration, a ticketed event that includes cocktails in the galleries and an intimate dinner in Isabel Hall. The event celebrates the art history and culture of South Asia and aims to further the FIA's mission of connecting diverse communities through fun, creative, and inspiring visual art experiences. Proceeds from the celebration will support education programs and expand the FIA's South Asian art collection. We could not do it without our sponsors, so thank you to all the sponsors for supporting this wonderful event. And I'm going to go through all of the slides. Please hold your applause to the end. I'm not going to read all the names, though. So please take a look. Diamond, really grateful to the Diamond sponsor, Padma and Raj Vatakuti family. Our Ruby sponsors, Pearl sponsors, Turquoise sponsors. We leaned into the jewelry aspect with the sponsorship levels. The dessert sponsor, our in-kind sponsors, and our supporters. Give them all a round of applause, please. And none of that hard work could have been possible without the Splendors of South Asia Committee, co-chaired by Dr. Mona Hardis and Asha Kulkarni. Would all the committee members please stand so we can acknowledge you? The committee and all of the work they did is so amazing. We're so very proud to say that the event sold out within just a few months, and we will be bringing it back next year. So thank you. I would like to remind you that the Meditations in Gold South Asian Jewelry Exhibition is currently open through February 2nd, 2025. Please see our website, Members Magazine, or front desk for our hours. The exhibition features 68 works drawn from private collections and the FIA collection. Thank you, Jay and Prasad, for donating many of these works, and thank you to the lenders as well. The exhibition, if you haven't seen it, please see it tonight, but if you haven't, and bring a friend, of course, the exhibition's truly magnificent, the first of its kind at the FIA, and we're so proud to have it here in Flint. Before I introduce our guest, I would like to thank the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation for their continued support, which is so deeply appreciated and vital to the FIA. I would like to thank, yes, we can applaud, thank you. I would like to thank the residents and citizens of Genesee County for demonstrating their support of the FIA by means of the Genesee County Arts, Education, and Cultural Enrichment Millage, which also provides free entry to the FIA for Genesee County residents 7 days a week. Thank you. Also, a big thank you to Huntington Bank for sponsoring Huntington Free Saturdays, which allows everyone outside of the county free entry on Saturdays. Thank you, Huntington Bank. And thank you to the Ford Foundation Equity Fund of the Community Foundation of Greater Flint for making the ASL interpretation possible tonight. Now the moment you've all been waiting for. Silence your cell phones and anything else that makes noise. It's really my pleasure to welcome back Dr. Siddhartha Shah, who spoke at the inaugural Come Ready Family Lecture, and I've gotten to know him since then, and he's really just a joy to be around, and I know you're going to really enjoy the lecture tonight. Dr. Shah is the John Wieland 1958 director of the Mead Art Museum at Amherst College. He was previously the Director of Education and Civic Engagement and Curator of South Asian Art at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, which is home to one of the leading collections of modern Indian art outside of the subcontinent. He earned his BA in Art History from Johns Hopkins University, an MA in Hindu Philosophy and Jungian Psychoanalysis from the California Institute of Integral Studies, and a PhD in Art History from Columbia University. Everyone, please join me in a warm Flint welcome for Dr. Siddhartha Shah.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Thank you to FIA's fantastic director, Tracy Glab, for that warm welcome and introduction, to the members of the staff who I've had the pleasure to meet, and to all of you for joining me. And my thanks, of course, to Jay and Prasad Komaredi for sponsoring this lecture series, for making it possible for me to be here with all of you tonight. I have a very deep affection for this place and for this community. I really love what this museum does. I have so much respect and confidence in Tracy's leadership, and I love what this museum represents to the great city of Flint. So it's an honor to be back, and thank you again for this invitation. So to get started on perhaps an unexpected note. In the days following the attempted assassination of former President Trump, I recall a particularly telling moment when my partner and I were hanging out. I was in one corner of a room, doom scrolling on my phone, and I can't recall if Perry was on his computer or reading a book. But he was in a tizzy about what had just happened, an assassination attempt, the violence that we hope never to see, including against those whose views may differ from our own. Completely absorbed in the images on my phone, I heard him ask me, "Is your phone blowing up with posts about the assassination attempt?" Without even making eye contact, my fingers just speedily scrolling the length of my iPhone, I said, "We clearly have different algorithms because all I'm seeing on my phone is the Ambani wedding." Indeed, during one of the most dramatic moments of our forthcoming presidential election, Anant Ambani and Radhika Merchant were feting their $600 million wedding in Mumbai, including the $5 million that Rihanna was purportedly paid to perform at the pre-wedding festivities, $10 million that went to Justin Bieber. A side note, I have serious concerns about that discrepancy in pay. Invitations that cost approximately $7,000 each, and insane operational logistics that included coordinating private jets, a $150 million Mediterranean cruise for 800 guests, 5,500 drones zooming about, printed programs that included a 9-page dress code, and apparently over 500 food vendors. It was a glorious, over-the-top of the top $600 million wedding. But in my doom scrolling, I wasn't terribly interested in what Mark Zuckerberg or Kim Kardashian were wearing, nor was I curious about which politicians or celebrities were present. I admit, I do get a kick out of watching the Ambani family dance numbers, but really there was one thing and one thing alone I was curious about. The bling. My God, the bling. Enormous emeralds, thousands upon thousands of diamonds, Isha Ambani's blouse that was made of actual antique jewelry pieces stitched together, I'd pull up these posts on social media, stretch my thumb and forefinger wide across the screen of my iPhone to zoom in on the enormous rocks I saw. I'd occasionally take screenshots. I was just totally blown away by the sheer scale and volume of the jewelry. It was outrageous. But it wasn't just the women who were dripping in jewels. The bridegroom, Ananth, pulled out some of the wildest brooches I've ever seen. A jewel-encrusted Lord Srinathji, paired with diamond and emerald buttons on one day. A golden lion drooling, this is very sensitive, sorry. A golden lion drooling a 50-carat diamond from its mouth. And this 720-carat emerald brick topped by a Cartier panther, to name just a few. It was nice to see him all blinged out like that. Not just jeweled buttons or a sarpesh, which is a turban ornament, which are all acceptable boy bling in Indian fashion, but he was wearing brooches, and they suit him well. But here's the thing. Brooches are typically worn by women in Western fashion. When I think of brooches, I immediately think of, as you saw, the late Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who famously used them to convey messages about foreign policy, including deploying them strategically to project hope, impatience, allegiance, and according to text from the Read My Pins exhibition of her brooches, warm feelings and warnings too. Just one example. When Saddam Hussein's poet-in-residence referred to Albright as an unparalleled serpent, she embraced the moniker by wearing this snake brooch when preparing to meet with Iraqi officials. And here, during a vote of the, of the UN Security Council. I share this example not just to demonstrate how jewelry can embody potent messages about power, politics, and identity, but also to highlight how strange it is that we gender jewelry, as in brooches as objects that are typically worn by women. Issues around gender in jewelry are quite personal for me. I have been and still remain quite invested in breaking down the gendering of jewelry, in part because I, as a man of Indian origin, have worn some kind of jewelry since I was a child. For those familiar with South Asian cultural practices, this emerald ring I wear on my hand is immediately recognizable as a specific astrological prescription. Like many men in my family, I wear a gold chain. I also have a necklace of Rudraksh beads, which are associated with the Hindu god Shiva. Nothing about this is really out of the ordinary. But for many, my jewelry has triggered all kinds of associations and ideas about me. My rings and gold chains have been called flashy, and the earrings I wear have come across to some as if I'm trying to show off or to make a statement. But most of all, the jewelry I wear has regularly been read as some kind of evidence or affirmation of my homosexuality, which I find really strange. That my jewelry is somehow intended to provoke or that it's gender bending, which has never been my intention at all. I mean, there are plenty of straight men in India throughout history who've worn long or large earrings, necklaces, and rings. So where is this really coming from? A rather common astrological prescription in India, like to wear a pearl on one's last little ring finger, can be read in the West as a flamboyant pinky ring using the most feminine of precious materials, the pearl. I mean, what kind of man wears pearls? Perhaps being gay and growing up in spaces where that facet of my identity was not easily embraced, I developed a kind of resilience against what people think or say about how I talk, walk, dress, or behave. But that so many have read my comfort with jewelry as linked to my sexual identity rather than to my culture of origin has been pretty jarring. And it highlights precisely the issue that I wish to address today. Ornament as meaningful symbol in India, and the perception of ornament as excessive, flamboyant, and femme, which has emboldened some to feminize India and Indian men for hundreds of years. So tonight, I speak to you not just about jewels and gender. My aim, rather, is to provide some background on the symbolic and social function of jewels in both their Indian and British colonial contexts, and to share a few stories of how jewels intersect with notions of masculinity and femininity as spoils of conquests, and in some cases as tools of rebellion. Jewels have long played an essential role in styling the auspicious Indian body, as evidenced even in the earliest art excavated on the subcontinent. In the Indian context, the ideal body, one that is full of vigor and beauty, is always the body adorned. And it's in particular the royal or divine male body that is most heavily ornamented in jewels, investing the god, king, or god-king with qualities of auspiciousness and empowerment, fully adorned and thus fully endowed with the power to rule. Whether a Mughal emperor, a Maratha or Rajput king, or a sultan of the Deccan Plateau, an Indian ruler needed not only to be an effective lord and protector, but he needed also, and perhaps more importantly, to look the part. His lavish jewels provided a scopic articulation of power, investing his body with the supernatural visual qualities of shifting color and light. Dressed in a jeweled splendor matched only by the gods, the glitz and bling of a ruler's body projected an impression of divinely sanctioned authority. Pearls appear abundantly in representations of gods and men in the art of South Asia. And I believe this has to do with more than just the fact that the Gulf of Mannar in South India was a major source for harvesting pearls. The natural and mysterious processes by which pearls are created endowed them with a range of magical meanings in both Eastern and Western thought. Writing around 2,000 years ago, Pliny the Elder recorded that the pearl is formed when a drop of dew falls from heaven into the sea. His passage presents an early connection between pearls and ideas of femininity and fertility. Quote, "When stimulated by the season for procreation, they," meaning the oysters, "open up, as it were, and are impregnated with dew. Then these pregnant shells give birth, and their offsprings are pearls." Queen Elizabeth I was often depicted wearing a profusion of pearls, styled as a pristine virgin with connections to the natural world and natural processes like motherhood. The pronounced display of pearls in this famed Armada portrait aligns the monarch with both the sea and fecundity, where a giant pearl positioned conspicuously between her legs serves as an emblem of chastity, as well as the possibility of abundant fertility, further enunciated in late 16th and early 17th century portraits of pregnant women, in an excess of pearls to underscore their own fertility. But particularly in the first half of the 17th century, pearls found their way onto the bodies of Englishmen too, most notably King Charles I, who sported a sizable pearl in his left ear, which he also famously wore to his own beheading. Topped with a cross and orb, the pearl was perhaps intended to align the king with the faultless, immaculate body of Christ. But much like its paradoxical function on women's bodies, pearls could be worn by men to convey either innocence or virility too. Pearls as a metaphor for sexual fluid. One rather cheeky instance provides a compelling example. The first Duke of Buckingham, George Villiers, was one of King Charles I's closest advisors, renowned far and wide for his physical beauty and grace. One bishop described him as the handsomest bodied man of England, while another used even more flattering terms, quote, "From the nails of his fingers, nay, from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him." In 1625, the Duke traveled to Paris to represent the king at his marriage by proxy to the Princess of France. Ever a consummate showman, he took with him 27 dazzling outfits for the occasion, including a gray velvet suit studded with pearls to wear at his first audience with the Queen of France. The pearls were, it seems, sewn on loosely in order to fall off. As he walked past the French court, pearls spilled from his body and rolled across the floor of the audience chamber. Taking no notice, the handsome duke walked towards the queen and discharged even more pearls from his magnificent body as he offered her a bow. Pearls scattered off of him in every direction as he gaily exited the chamber, a spectacle that foreshadowed the union of masculine virility and feminine fertility in the marriage of Charles I with the Princess of France. In India, emperors of the Mughal Empire were particularly fond of wearing pearls, and often appear in paintings wearing them in their ears and around their necks. In this image, Emperor Jahangir receives a string of pearls from his son, Prince Khusrau. 2 other princes and 3 courtiers are also in attendance, yet only the royal men wear pearl necklaces, several interspersed with emeralds and red spinels. Maratha, Rajput, and Sikh kings also wore pearls as emblems of their wealth, prestige, and virile fortitude. For years, the Maharajas of Patiala were seen wearing a 14-strand necklace of outstanding pearls, but most renowned of all were the legendary Baroda pearls, a 7-strand necklace of large, bright, and absolutely perfect pearls commissioned in the 19th century, which formed the cornerstone of one of India's most impressive treasuries. Indian kings proudly adorned their chests in ropes of pearls, while European ladies of the 19th century strung them around the necks and over their breasts as symbols of feminine beauty. Harvested at the farthest reaches of the empire, pearls were an important accessory for a proper lady of society, essentially aligning the sartorial practices of Western women with those of Indian men. This conflation both highlighted and substantiated the belief in the British imagination of the inherent effeminacy and intrinsic weakness of Indian men. On the body of the Indian king, pearls could represent a range of things related to power. Wealth, of course, but also purity, divinity, and sexual virility. But all this was so easily lost in translation due to the countless associations of pearls with women. But India has long been associated with women's items in the West. Pliny the Elder famously blamed the collapse of the Roman Empire's economy on the women of Rome by highlighting their obsession with Indian pearls and cotton, while the rage for muslin, chintz, and shawls negatively impacted French and British economies well into the 19th century and beyond, with most Westerners experiencing India through commodities linked to femininity and domesticity, like dress material, upholstery fabric, spices and tea for the kitchen, jewelry, and Kashmiri shawls. The feminized fantasy of India extended also to perceptions of Indian men, exemplified in the remarks of the 18th century historian Robert Orme. In his study entitled, it's such an offensive title, The Effeminacy of the Inhabitants of Hindostan, he wrote, "We see throughout India a race of men whose make, physiognomy, and muscular strength convey ideas of an effeminacy, when compared to the form of the European who is making the observation. So their manner of dress, as well as the numerous foreign conquests of India throughout history, were all viewed as evidence of the weakness of Indian rulers, who were far more interested in exquisite fabrics and outrageous baubles than in mastering the muscular martial arts of combat and warfare. But I'd argue that this strange preoccupation with the effeminacy of Indian men was merely a symptom of larger gender anxieties, particularly in Victorian England. Or, as we might tell a child today, if someone is teasing or bullying you, there must be something going on at home. I believe this unstable British masculinity was sparked by the fact that a female ruler was at Britain's helm. Women, by convention, were considered the physically and intellectually weaker sex, including by Queen Victoria herself, who referred to the very idea of equal rights for women as mad, wicked folly. The ideal woman of the Victorian period was visualized as the angel in the house, who served her husband as a submissive wife and her offspring as a self-sacrificing mother. Yet as monarch, Victoria was superior to all men, including her own husband, which evoked more than a fair amount of anxiety in her subjects. As queen, she had to ask Albert for his hand in marriage, which made many British men insecure about losing their supremacy over women, while also raising doubts about Albert's own manliness. A lithograph from 1840 commemorates the moment in which Victoria famously proposed to her handsome German cousin. Albert sits up rigidly with a reserved expression on his lowered face. Passive and coquettish, he clenches his top hat nervously between his legs, too bashful to meet Victoria's adoring gaze. In contrast, the queen unabashedly wraps her right arm over his shoulder and immodestly strokes his chin as the words, "Albert, will you marry me?" emerge from her mouth. Threatened by a woman's place on the throne and a growing women's rights movement, a new robust masculinity emerged in Britain that was far less Christian and chivalrous than earlier in the century, and radically more militant and muscular. To that end, Indian princes, swathed in silk and dripping in jewels, provided a perfect foil against which to articulate and measure the primacy of British masculinity. I thus read the persistent emasculation of Indian men as a means by which to bolster a fragile, very unstable British masculinity. And the tale of a specific jewel, the Koh-i-Noor diamond, offers a telling case study, one in which the prince consort's anxiety about his own masculine public presentation was played out on the world's most famous jewel. Of the many jewels that circulated among Indian empires and dynasties, the Koh-i-Noor, or Mountain of Light, possessed the most lore and signified the greatest power. Worn in the turbans and around the biceps of powerful men, the diamond was an emblem of martial prowess and kingly conquest. There are certainly stones that are larger and more beautiful than the Koh-i-Noor, but having passed through the hands of many legendary rulers and with a remarkably rich historical and mythological past, the diamond retains an allure that no other jewel can claim. The Emperor Shah Jahan is most renowned for commissioning the Taj Mahal, though he reportedly spent twice as much on his illustrious peacock throne, which he commissioned in 1628, featuring 108 red spinels that were between 100 and 200 carats each, 116 emeralds between 30 and 60 carats, and a canopy fully studded with enormous diamonds and pearls. It included a number of the world's most famous jewels, including the 361-carat Timor ruby, the pink table-cut diamond known as the Darya-i-Noor, and the 187-carat Koh-i-Noor diamond. After the Persian ruler Nader Shah sacked Delhi and carried off the peacock throne in 1739, the Koh-i-Noor passed through various hands and across numerous kingdoms until it made its way to the founder of the Sikh Empire, Maharaja Ranjit Singh, in 1813. Childhood smallpox had claimed one of his eyes and marked his face permanently with dark scars. But what Ranjit Singh lacked in physical appearance, he possessed as impassioned charisma that outshined even the enormous diamond he proudly wore on his arm. Recounting his meeting with the Maharaja in 1838, Captain William Osborne described the has a mind of its own. The Captain William Osborne described the aging ruler as dressed in simple white, wearing no ornaments but a single string of enormous pearls round the waist, and the celebrated Koh-i-Noor in his arm. The jewel rivaled, if not surpassed in brilliancy, by the glance of fire which every now and then shot from his single eye. Following his death in 1839, 3 weak successors all died shortly after ascending the throne, leaving Ranjit Singh's kingdom to his 5-year-old son, Dulip Singh. The next 6 years were riddled with instability and war, ushering in the annexation of the Punjab by the British in 1849. Civil authorities banished Dulip Singh's mother, Maharani Jind Kaur, and took possession of the priceless Lahore treasury. While the East India Company designated the entire treasury as booty, the Governor-General of India, Lord Dalhousie, singled out the Koh-i-Noor with the aspiration that it should be offered to Queen Victoria and assimilated into the crown jewels. Now, there were many objects of superior beauty and of more impressive design in the Lahore treasury than the Koh-i-Noor diamond, but Dalhousie chose for his queen the most legendary one. He wrote in his diary, quote, "The Koh-i-Noor has ever been the symbol of conquest. The Emperor of Delhi had it in his peacock throne, and now, when as the result of unprovoked war, the British government has conquered the kingdom of Punjab, I have a right to compel the Maharaja of Lahore, in token of his submission, to surrender the jewel to the Queen, that it may find its final and fitting resting place in the crown in Britain." End quote. Given the rich biography of the Koh-i-Noor as an emblem of conquest, its introduction into the British crown jewels would be an effective way to memorialize the downfall and appropriation of India into the British Empire. The Koh-i-Noor as the jewel in the crown of the British monarch, and India as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. On May 16, 1850, the armlet containing the Koh-i-Noor was put on a ship, and 2 months later it was presented to Queen Victoria at Buckingham Palace. The diamond's arrival in London was, however, clouded by a series of unfortunate events that left many wondering if the stone had cast an ominous oriental shadow over England. The day it arrived, former Prime Minister Robert Peel fell off of his horse, who in turn fell on top of him, and he was crushed to death. And while she mourned the loss of this dear friend and ally, Queen Victoria was herself in recovery from having been struck over the head with the iron handle of a cane by an angry male subject. Rumors began to circulate that the Koh-i-Noor was cursed, but the press devised a corrective to the cloud of superstition surrounding the diamond. The Koh-i-Noor brought bad luck only to the Oriental men who had owned it before. As a British monarch who was a woman, Victoria rendered the jewel's malignant powers useless. So the diamond of fallen Eastern kings was thus reconfigured as a portent of good fortune for royal white women alone. But it was Prince Albert who was particularly enthusiastic about the Koh-i-Noor's arrival, and used its exotic allure to generate further interest in the Great Exhibition of 1851, at which the diamond would be unveiled. As Victoria's prince consort, he had no official powers or duties, and many of the typical features of royal masculinity were possessed by his wife. His involvement in projects that emphasized the masculine domains of science and progress, like the Great Exhibition, was one of the most effective ways for Albert to fashion himself as a man of vision and innovation. Success of the Great Exhibition would thus be a proclamation of his own economic and cultural prowess. Now, the Queen was certainly aware of the imbalance of power within their marriage, and tried in various ways to elevate her husband's status, including through the mass distribution of collectible cartes de visite. So these were photographs that you would then distribute to friends, or in their case, subjects. Staged as a spectacle of royal domestic privacy, she fashioned herself as a doting wife, and her husband as a physically powerful man. One of the images, the one you see here, features Prince Albert sitting with a book in his hand while Victoria touches his shoulder. His sidelong glance comes across as a glare of irritation, while Victoria's lowered eyes seem exceedingly meek and almost apologetic. If their poses don't sufficiently highlight his authority, the fact that Albert sits while Victoria stands certainly does, because typically no one sits in the presence of the monarch until invited or told to do so. Where Victoria and Albert stand on level ground, Albert assumes a proud, confident posture, while Victoria's eyes barely reach his shoulders. And in this image, Victoria stands on a step above him, but the addition of a top hat as a prop accentuates Albert's towering position over her. Such photographs have commonly been read as stressing Victoria's domestic femininity, but we could also interpret them as being staged to convey his manliness. The Koh-i-Noor was also assimilated into the construction and dissemination of Albert's masculine persona. The Great Exhibition of 1851 opened on May the 1st, and visitors to the India court were immediately struck by Queen Victoria's gold howdah perched on the back of a dead stuffed elephant. Dressed in colorful fabrics and with ornaments hanging from its ears, the flamboyantly festooned beast mirrored the barbaric pomp of India's princes, while explicitly highlighting British domination over the once powerful land. Touted by the press as the lion of the Great Exhibition, the Koh-i-Noor sat isolated in its own specially designated exhibition space. Removed from the armlet, the Koh-i-Noor with its two pendant diamonds were displayed under a structure described by one observer as a golden cage or a prison, topped with a small golden crown. Beneath its imposing enclosure, and viewed from a considerable distance, the diamond appeared, quote, not bigger than half a fair-sized walnut, end quote. Quite like the India court, the Koh-i-Noor was presented, hold on, there. The Koh-i-Noor was presented as a spectacle with a feminine appeal. An illustration in the satirical publication Punch depicts women in their imposing hoop skirts swarming around the jewel, which is completely hidden from view. The gold enclosure towers over them, its voluminous shape mimicking the rounded edges of the women's skirts. The cage itself appears like a giant hoop skirt with a crown at its top, transforming the diamond's confines into the imperial body of Queen Victoria, who subsumes the Koh-i-Noor and by extension all of India represented by it. Crowds waited for hours to catch a glimpse of the Koh-i-Noor, which, quote, disappointed the public in no ordinary degree, end quote. Many balked at its size, assuming it was much larger. There's actually illustrations in the same publication of a family looking at a massive quartz crystal and asking if that was the Koh-i-Noor diamond. So they were confused by how small it was, while others were simply confused by its ungraceful peculiarity of shape. Most disappointing of all, however, was that the diamond failed to sparkle, due in large part to the manner in which it had been cut. It did not conform to European modes of diamond cutting that emphasized internal reflections, but rather the Indian interest in preserving as much of the diamond's natural size, shape, and thus its talismanic properties. After all the attention that the Koh-i-Noor had garnered in the press, the mountain turned out to be no larger than the size of a nut, and the light it cast paled in comparison even to the dull English sun. Ashamed and disheartened by the diamond's tepid reception, Prince Albert wanted the stone recut, an assault on the jewel that would certainly increase its luster, but inevitably reduce its size. He first contacted a number of British scientists to seek their advice on how best to release from the stone its fullest light, and next approached diamond cutters, many of whom just refused to get involved out of concern that the Koh-i-Noor would be irreparably damaged. A Dutch firm submitted a proposal, assuring Albert that only a negligible amount of the carat weight would be discarded. He accepted the plan, and the aggressive procedure of reshaping the diamond began on July 16, 1852, with the 83-year-old Duke of Wellington invited to make the first cut. So this like offensive illustration shows him leading this oriental diamond with like a Turkish hat and Chinese robes towards some form of guillotine, where he's going to undergo some kind of, I mean, it's so disturbing. So the Duke of Wellington was the most venerated military hero in Britain, for his successful campaigns in India and for having defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. As the emblem par excellence of British masculinity, his appointment as the first to strike the diamond further suggests an assertion of British masculine forces on the former emblem of Indian kings. You can almost think of this as a kind of cultural or racial reassignment surgery, whereas all that was distinctly Oriental or Indian about the jewel was excised, while the remainder was refined and civilized along British standards. The press once again eagerly presented Albert as a pioneer of progress for strategizing the recut of the stone, along with a squadron of scientists and military heroes at his behest. Like the great exhibition in the previous year, recutting the diamond became his project through which he could assert his masculine identity and inscribe it permanently onto the stone. While the London press reiterated the promise that the diamond would be cut without greatly reducing its size, the claim quickly unraveled, in part because these celebrities were invited periodically to like make a cut, and then the press would come and write about it. The stone could simply not sustain such a drastic alteration without significant loss. The Koh-i-Noor ultimately lost 43% of its original weight. In the end, the 186-carat Mughal diamond was replaced by a 105-carat oval stellar brilliant. Meanwhile, in India, the deposed Maharaja Dulip Singh was enduring his own civilizing process, having been placed by Lord Dalhousie in the care of John and Lena Logan. He converted to Christianity, and as a teenager grew enthusiastic about a visit to England, for which permission was granted in 1854. Upon meeting him, Queen Victoria was so impressed by the handsome 15-year-old's picturesque Sikhness that she had her favorite painter Franz Winterhalter make his portrait. The painting depicts the young king dressed in silks and wearing some of the jewels he was allowed to keep when his treasury was confiscated. A small portrait of Queen Victoria hangs off the pearl choker he wears tightly around his neck, a pendant that displays his allegiance to, as well as his dependence on his master, the queen, like the collar and tag one might find on a domesticated pet. It was while posing for this famous portrait that Victoria decided to show him the new Koh-i-Noor. An account from Mrs. Logan's memoirs describes this terribly awkward encounter during which the Maharaja saw and touched his diamond, which had been reduced to nearly half its size. I'm quoting here. A slight bustle near the door made me look in that direction, and I beheld to my amazement the gorgeous uniforms of a group of beefeaters from the tower, escorting an official bearing a small casket, which he presented to Her Majesty. This she opened hastily and took therefrom a small object. The queen cried out, "Maharaja, I have something to show you." Dulip Singh stepped hurriedly down to the floor, and before he knew what was happening, found himself once more with the Koh-i-Noor in his grasp, while the queen was asking him if he thought it improved, if he would have recognized it again. As he walked towards the window to examine it more closely, turning it hither and hither to let the light upon its facets, there was a passion of repressed emotion in his face, patent to one who knew him well, and evident, I think, to Her Majesty, who watched him with sympathy not unmixed with anxiety. That I may truly say, it was to me one of the most excruciatingly uncomfortable quarters of an hour that I have ever passed. Seeing him standing there, turning and turning the stone about in his hands, as if unable to part with it again. At last, as if summoning up his resolution after a profound struggle, and with a deep sigh, he raised his eyes from the jewel and moved deliberately to where Her Majesty was standing, and with a deferential reverence placed in her hand the famous diamond with the words, "It is to me, ma'am, the greatest pleasure thus to have the opportunity as a loyal subject of myself tendering to my sovereign, the Koh-i-Noor." End quote. Dulip Singh made no mention then or ever about the many other jewels from his treasury that had been given to Queen Victoria. Later in life, however, he made several unsuccessful attempts to reclaim the Koh-i-Noor, which he felt had been unjustly obtained. The jewel-wearing kings of India had come to be aligned with opulence and femininity in England, with many of their precious gems, like Dulip Singh's diamond, finding new homes on women's bodies. The Koh-i-Noor that had for generations adorned the turbans and biceps of Indian men had been transformed into a brooch on the breast of a queen, with Prince Albert orchestrating the entire procedure. Through it, Victoria managed to enhance her feminine public persona, announce the power of her husband, proclaim her imperial fortitude, and assert the conclusive subordination of India, all with just one stone. The diamond moved from between a brooch, a bracelet, and a tiara during her lifetime, and continued to move between settings following her death in 1901. Queen Alexandra had the jewel placed in the center of her coronation crown, and it was subsequently worn by Queen Mary in 1911 and by Elizabeth in 1937. Since its arrival in England, the diamond has never been worn by a male, reserved exclusively for royal women. I'll note that while many were curious to see if Camilla, the current queen consort, would wear the Koh-i-Noor in her coronation crown, she opted not to, which is probably the smartest thing given various calls from various countries for the jewel's return. At another moment, when the British royals are trying to prove that they are not out of touch, wearing the most infamous diamond would not have supported this latest effort to refashion the monarchy. Prince Albert's untimely death in 1861 threw Victoria into an extended period of seclusion, and she dressed exclusively in black widow's weeds for the remaining 40 years of her life. Though she did occasionally wear the Koh-i-Noor diamond, a persistent mood of bereavement and sorrow took a toll on her subjects, who after several decades were rather starved for celebration. Later in her reign, as the Queen's Golden Jubilee of 1887 approached, her subjects and her government were keen to honor her 50-year reign with full fanfare, but as usual, Victoria refused to wear any straight robes or ceremonial crowns. Concerned by the utter lack of gusto in the aging widow of Windsor, the government resolved to invite Indian princes to the Jubilee, who would liven things up with their characteristic pomp and oriental flair. The bling and glitz of Indian royals was thus viewed as ample compensation for the Queen's absolute lack of charisma. Their ornamental function was further underscored by a dress code imposed on them. A letter sent to the Viceroy from the India Office in London stated, "The Queen wishes them, the princes, all to appear in native costume. European costume would be distasteful." The bejeweled Indian princes, who had for so long been a subject of harsh criticism, found new meaning in the spectacles of the Raj. In the 3 Delhi Durbars of 1877, 1903, and 1911, Indian princes were invited to participate, but again with a strict mandate on how they were to appear. Here, too, they were instructed to wear their finest clothes and jewels as signifiers of their respect, loyalty, and submission. The costumes, turbans, and jewels of the native princes, which had earlier conveyed their superior status, now provided entertainment for their British overlords, in a procession that was part military parade and part circus. They were viewed not as dignified kings, but as living curiosities who were as barbaric as they were magnificent. Years later, Mahatma Gandhi wrote about his own experience of seeing the procession of Maharajas at the Delhi Durbar of 1903. His observations convey both his displeasure at their treatment, as well as his own rejection of princely Indian regalia. It actually makes me question how much of the British emasculation of Indian ornament Gandhi may have accepted and internalized. Quote, I was distressed to see the Maharajas bedecked like women. Pearl necklaces round their necks, bracelets on their wrists, pearl and diamond tassels on their turbans. I discovered these were insignia not of their royalty, but of their slavery. I had thought they must be wearing these badges of impotence of their own free will, but I was told it was obligatory for these Rajas to wear all their costly jewels at such functions. But whether they wear them on other occasions or not, it is distressing enough to have to attend viceregal durbars in jewels that only women wear. End quote. But long before Gandhi fashioned himself as a revolutionary devoid of any trappings of luxury or ornament, the Maharaja Sayaji Rao Gaikwad III of Baroda silently rebelled against the British in his own sartorial demonstration of resistance. Rather than adhere to the mandate that he wear his famed diamonds and pearls, he attended the 1911 Durbar in an exceedingly modest kurta, which drew loud cheers from the otherwise stoic Indian public. His refusal to play the part of the flamboyant native roused accusations against him of sedition. In what would later be known as the Durbar Incident, the Maharaja's most powerful weapon of resistance was his legendary necklace, the Baroda pearls, which he refused to wear for such an occasion, averting the ridicule of those who occupied his country and sending a very clear message that the Durbar was absolutely no occasion worthy of his precious jewels. Today, it's frankly quite rare to see the jewels of Indian royals, as many do not want to reveal what they still possess in their treasuries or what they have chosen or perhaps been obligated to sell. Those famed Baroda pearls hadn't been seen for decades until 2 strands appeared at auction in 2007 and sold for $7.1 million. In general, I'd say that Indian royals have taken a stance that in some ways replicates the path of British royals before Victoria received the Koh-i-Noor, distancing themselves from old world ostentation, while many wealthy Indians, like the ones I opened with, live out their royal fantasies in over-the-top weddings and looks that give brave new meaning to more is more. But for me, as a man with familial ties to Baroda, and who is not of royal descent, to wear jewelry, and specifically pearls, that holds deep personal and cultural meaning continues to be a way to connect to my familial roots, to my culture that has a long and refined history of aesthetic sophistication and shameless celebration of beauty. It is a way to connect to my mother and my grandmothers and the women and men before them. In some ways, for me, wearing jewelry becomes a political statement and a way to reclaim what was for so long accepted and true. Don't men also deserve to feel beautiful? Can't we also take pleasure in wearing jewels? I find it pretty exciting and somewhat reassuring when I see more and more male celebrities in both the East and the West wearing pearls and jewelry in general, to break down this gendering of jewels as we continue to explore the prismatic spectrum that is gender expression. Though the press may tout these creative interventions into men's fashion as queer or revolutionary, it's a good moment to call out that this is not new or groundbreaking. In some ways, it is a return to tradition, perhaps even a reclamation of what it means to be a man, or a way to bridge the gender divide between men and women when it comes to dress and self-expression. I had earlier asked, somewhat in jest, what kind of man wears pearls? My response to that question is quite simple: any man who's man enough to wear them. Thank you.